I put 2 clay pots on my bedroom floor, packed sand between them, added water, and 2 hours later, the area around my bed was 8 degrees cooler. No AC, no fan, no plug. Total cost, $5. Your electricity bill this summer is going to be the highest it has ever been. Not by a little. The EIA confirmed rates are hitting 17.6 cents per kilowatt hour in 2026. The average American household already paid $784 just for summer cooling last year, $196 a month for 4 months, and that number is going up again. In Texas, wholesale prices are spiking 45%. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, people are paying 30 cents per kilowatt hour. 4 million households had their power disconnected in 2025, and this summer is expected to be hotter than the last. I put 2 unglazed terracotta pots on the floor of my bedroom 3 weeks ago. One sitting inside the other, coarse sand packed between them, wet cloth draped over the top. No plug, no fan, no refrigerant, no moving parts. And within 2 hours, the air directly around that pot dropped noticeably. Not 4 degrees, not 6, I measured it. The zone within 3 feet of that setup was 8 to 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the room. My AC had been running every single day before that. It has not turned on once since I moved the setup to the right spot. I want to show you exactly what I did, why it works, where most people fail, and why you have never heard about this, despite the fact that every major civilization on Earth used it for 4,000 years before your utility company existed. This is evaporative cooling. And the reason the $240 billion HVAC industry has never once explained it to you is embarrassingly simple. You cannot patent wet clay, you cannot sell a subscription to coarse sand, you cannot charge installation fees for a terracotta pot, you absolutely cannot build a quarterly earnings report around something a person can assemble in 20 minutes for $5. That is the entire reason this knowledge moved from common to forgotten in the span of about 2 decades, somewhere between 1950 and 1970. When refrigerant-based air conditioning went mass market and the industry spent enormous money making sure you thought of everything else as primitive. It was not primitive. It was physics, and it still is. Let me take you back to 2500 BC because this matters for understanding why the setup works, not just that it works. Egyptians in the Old Kingdom were sleeping in cooled rooms without any technology that runs on anything except airflow and moisture. Frescoes recovered from tombs in the Nile Delta show servants fanning large, porous clay jars filled with water near sleeping chambers. The air moving across the wet clay surface carried heat away from the room. Pharaohs slept cooler than the desert outside. That is not a poetic detail. That is a documented thermodynamic system that has been reproduced and validated in engineering literature. Servants fanning clay pots were not decoration. They were the ancient equivalent of your HVAC technician, except the system cost nothing and lasted indefinitely. In Persia, architects built entire structures around this principle. Wind catchers, badgir in Persian, were towers built into the roofs of homes that captured prevailing breezes and directed them down into rooms where they passed over wet clay surfaces and underground water channels before reaching the living quarters. Some of those buildings are still standing. Some are still measurably cooler inside than outside on a hot day, with no electricity, no refrigerant, and no maintenance required in over 1,000 years. The engineers who designed them understood airflow and evaporation at a level most modern HVAC salespeople would struggle to explain. In India, weavers hung grass mats called koos curtains in doorways, soaked them with water, and let afternoon breezes pass through. The temperature drop on the other side of the mat was not subtle. It was the difference between sleeping and not sleeping. Across North Africa, clay storage pots kept food cool for days in desert heat, using nothing but moisture and porosity. Every civilization that dealt with serious heat before the age of electricity solved it the same way. Not because they lacked options, because they understood that evaporation pulls heat out of air, and clay is a machine built by nature to manage exactly that process. The physics is straightforward, and I want you to understand it, because once you do, you will see immediately why the setup details matter so much. When water evaporates, it does not disappear. It changes phase from liquid to vapor, and that phase change requires energy. That energy comes directly from the surface the water is leaving. The molecules that escape into the air carry thermal energy with them. The surface, whether it is wet clay, wet sand, wet fabric, becomes cooler as a result. Air moving across that cooler surface gets cooled too. This is called evaporative cooling, and it is the same thermodynamic process that makes sweat work on your skin. The clay pot is not a gimmick. It is a porous ceramic structure whose entire wall is filled with microscopic channels that wick water from the inside to the outside surface continuously and passively. You do not manage it. You do not check it every few minutes. You saturate the sand between 2 pots with water, and the outer pot weeps moisture through its wall for hours, cooling constantly, even when there is no breeze, even when no one is watching. That is what makes it different from a wet cloth hanging in a window. The cloth dries. The clay pot regulates its own moisture release through the sand layer. Now here is where I made my first mistake, and where most people who try this online fail. The sand between the pots is not filler. It is not just there to hold the inner pot in place. It is the engine. The sand layer must hold water steadily, release it slowly, and have enough surface contact with the inner pot wall and the outer pot wall to keep both sides continuously damp. Regular potting soil fails completely. I packed dry garden soil between mine the first time, set it up, and waited. The effect was almost nothing. It took me 3 days to understand why. Potting soil compacts. It forms air pockets. It dries unevenly. It has organic material that actually insulates instead of conducting moisture. What you need is coarse sand, the kind you can find at any garden center or hardware store, sometimes called builder's sand or horticultural grit. The grain size is important. Fine sand, the beach kind or the play kind, packs too tight and holds too little water in the spaces between grains. Coarse sand, the kind where you can see individual grains clearly, holds water between particles, releases it slowly through capillary action, and keeps both pot walls continuously wet for hours per watering. That is the difference between a setup that works and one that frustrates you into dismissing the whole concept. The sand is the critical variable that every article that has ever mentioned clay pot cooling glosses over completely because it is boring and because it does not sell anything. The second mistake I made was the pot selection. Not all clay pots are the same, and this is the detail that sinks most setups immediately. You need unglazed terracotta. The word matters. Unglazed. Glazed clay pots are sealed with a glass-like coating that is specifically designed to prevent water from passing through the walls. A glazed clay pot is a closed container. It cannot weep moisture. It cannot breathe. It is decorative. It is not a cooling device. You could fill a glazed pot with sand and water and wait for an era, and nothing would happen. At every garden center, both types sit next to each other on the shelf. The unglazed ones are matte, slightly rough to the touch, usually a warm orange-brown color without any shine. The glazed ones have a shiny surface and often come in colors. You want the matte, rough, uninteresting-looking ones. For a single-room setup, you need one large unglazed pot, ideally 12 to 14 inches in diameter, and one medium unglazed pot that fits inside the large one with roughly 1 to 2 inches of clearance all the way around. That gap is where your coarse sand goes. At most garden centers and home improvement stores, the large pot costs between $2 and $4. The medium pot costs $1 to $2. Coarse sand is either free if you have access to a construction site or a few dollars for a small bag. Total outlay is $5 or less, usually less. Here's the full setup. Plug the drainage hole in the inner pot. A small piece of cork or a flat river stone with a bit of clay pressed around it works. You do not want water seeping from the inner pot into the sand because the sand's job is to hold and slowly release water to the outer wall, not to fill the inner pot with humidity. Place the inner pot inside the outer pot. Fill the gap between them with coarse sand all the way to the top. Then slowly pour water into the sand until it will not absorb any more. You will see the outer pot begin to darken as moisture reaches the wall. That darkening is the system activating. Place a wet cloth over the top of the inner pot. This slows evaporation from the top and keeps the system efficient. Do not soak the cloth and wring it completely dry. You want it damp but not dripping, heavy but not wet. The sweet spot on the cloth is the same as what the script says about a sponge, just past saturation, not actively weeping. Now place the entire setup somewhere with airflow, near a window that gets a cross breeze, near a ceiling fan on the lowest setting, near an open doorway. Any gentle air movement accelerates the evaporation from the outer wall and drops the surface temperature faster. Without any airflow, the pot still works. With gentle airflow, it works meaningfully better. Rewetting takes about 30 seconds. Every 3 to 4 hours in dry heat, pour water back into the sand until it stops absorbing. In humid conditions, the evaporation slows. This is the honest limitation of the system, and I will address it directly because most videos about clay pot cooling skip it entirely, and it is why some people report 0 results. Humidity is the ceiling. When relative humidity in a room is above 70%, the air is already close to saturated with water vapor and cannot absorb much more. Evaporation slows dramatically. The cooling effect becomes marginal. If you are in Phoenix in July, this setup is almost unfairly effective. If you are in Miami in August, it will help at the margins, but will not replace your AC. The Egyptians and Persians who used this system were in dry desert environments. That is not a coincidence. That is physics. In dry, low-humidity heat, the kind that bakes the southwestern and central United States through summer, the pot is dramatically effective. In coastal, high-humidity environments, it is a supplement, not a solution. Knowing which category your climate falls into is the difference between being impressed and being disappointed. For a standard-sized bedroom in a dry climate, one large setup, 12-inch outer pot, and one positioned near the airflow source, drops the ambient temperature around it by 6 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 hours. I measured this with a cheap infrared thermometer aimed at the wall nearest the pot versus the wall farthest from it. The difference after 2 hours was consistent. It did not keep dropping indefinitely. But the zone immediately around the pot, the sleeping area, the desk area, the couch area, that zone stayed cooler for as long as the sand stayed wet. 2 setups in a medium-sized room running from a low-speed ceiling fan created a measurable effect across the whole room after 4 hours. Now compare that to what you're actually paying for the alternative. A standard window air conditioning unit costs $150 to $350 to purchase. It consumes roughly 500 to 1,500 watts per hour, depending on size and age. Running 8 hours a day at the national average rate of 17.6 cents per kilowatt hour adds roughly $35 to $80 per month to your bill, just for that one room. Every month it runs. Every summer, every year you own it. Over 5 years of summer use, a window unit costs you between $875 and $2,000 in electricity before you factor in repairs or replacement. A clay pot setup costs $5 once. The coarse sand does not expire. The pots do not break down. The water is from your tap. There is no filter to replace, no refrigerant to recharge, no compressor to fail, no thermostat to miscalibrate. The $240 billion industry built around cooling your home exists not because this 4,000-year-old method failed. It exists because this method cannot be monetized. The Egyptians figured out the thermodynamics. The industry figured out the quarterly earnings. This is not a replacement for air conditioning in every situation. I'm not going to claim that. In extreme heat, combined with extreme humidity, you need refrigerant-based cooling for safety. For elderly people and infants and people with certain medical conditions and serious heat emergencies, mechanical AC is a genuine medical tool. But for the average dry summer day, for the average room, for the 60 to 80% of hot days that are hot rather than dangerous, this works. It works the same way it worked for the Pharaoh's servants. It works the same way it worked for Persian architects. It works the same way it worked in every culture that ever faced serious heat before someone invented a quarterly earnings report around your discomfort. The full setup cost is $5. The materials last indefinitely. The operating cost is the tap water you pour into the sand every few hours. And the physics are 4,000 years old, documented, repeatable, and still working right now in every dry summer climate in the United States, while your utility company sends you another bill that went up 6% from last year, with no ceiling on the next one. If you try this setup this summer, drop it in the comments. Tell me your climate. Tell me where you put the pot. Tell me whether you noticed a difference. The thing I genuinely want to know is how this performs in different humidity zones across the country. Because the data on where this works well and where it hits its limits needs to be built from actual people running it in actual rooms, not from a laboratory in a controlled environment. Drop a comment with your state and your result. That information is useful.